The heat of the Sicilian summer pressed gently against Elena's skin as she stepped out of the car and onto the familiar gravel path leading to her grandfather's old vineyard. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the heavy sweetness of ripening grapes and the faint trace of sea salt drifting inland, scents that once belonged to her childhood but had long since become echoes she tried to silence. Now they rose around her again, insistent, tender, as though the land itself had been waiting for her return. The house loomed in its quiet dignity, shutters weathered by decades of sun and wind, yet still holding the warmth of evenings spent on the terrace, of stories told in low voices, of footsteps that would never again cross its threshold. Walking toward the entrance, she felt memories shifting like dust in sunlight, beautiful yet charged with a weight she had not prepared herself to carry. Inside, the rooms greeted her with a strange mixture of abandonment and presence. The faint smell of old wood, the stillness of the air, the whisper of pages when a breeze nudged an open book. She let her fingers slide across the kitchen counter, the same one where her grandfather used to line up glasses for tasting, each one filled with liquid sunlight pulled from the vines. A part of her wished she could walk through these corridors as someone unmarked by distance and regret, but the truth clung to her like the heat. She had left more than a place behind. She had left a life unfinished. The next morning, as the sun stretched across the hills in long golden bands, she stepped outside and followed the narrow path between the vines. That was when she saw him, Luca, standing with pruning shears in hand, his back turned to her, shoulders carrying the unmistakable tension of someone who had endured more than he would ever name. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, the look in his eyes held a quiet recognition, layered with something sharper, something like disbelief softened by memory. They exchanged a few cautious words, the kind that hover between politeness and old familiarity, each sentence carrying more silence than sound. Elena found herself studying his face, the harder lines, the faint fatigue beneath his calm, and wondered what losses had shaped him in the years she had spent away. As the morning unfolded, she watched Luca work among the vines with steady, practiced movements, as though the rhythm of the land anchored him even when nothing else did. There was something almost reverent in the way he touched each branch, trimming only what was necessary, leaving room for new growth to come. She felt a quiet ache rise in her chest, a mixture of admiration and a guilt she could not yet explain, sensing that he too had ghosts that clung to this place. The vineyard seemed to breathe alongside them, carrying the weight of both their histories in the rustle of leaves and the hum of cicadas hidden in the stillness. By late afternoon, the heat softened and shadows lengthened over the terrace. Elena found herself drawn to the overlook where the land met the sea, the horizon shimmering as though painted with molten gold. She leaned against the railing, letting the evening breeze cool her skin, and felt a tremor of nostalgia ripple through her, not just for the place, but for the version of herself she might have been had she never left. Behind her, the house stood silent, and somewhere within its old walls lingered stories she was only beginning to rediscover. As the first lights appeared along the distant shoreline, she sensed that this summer would not allow her to hide in the comfort of routine or memory. Something had already shifted. In her, in Luca, in the vineyard that seemed to watch them both. The day ended with Elena standing alone on the terrace, listening to the soft murmur of the sea below, and wondering what awaited her in the days to come. A quiet unease settled in her chest, delicate yet undeniable, like the first breeze before a storm. She did not know whether the past would unfold as a balm or a wound, but she felt the truth of one thing with unmistakable clarity. This land, this house, and the man she had unexpectedly found here would not allow her to remain unchanged. The next days unfolded with a gentle rhythm, as though the vineyard itself had decided to guide Elena through the unfamiliar tasks she was determined to master. In the early mornings, when the air was still cool and the sky held a faint lavender hue, She followed Luca into the rows of vines, watching how his hands moved with effortless precision. Her own attempts were far from graceful. She clipped too high, too low, or hesitated so long that the vines seemed to sigh beneath her uncertainty. Each mistake brought a warm flush to her cheeks, yet Luca responded not with irritation, but with a quiet, amused patience that softened the sternness she had seen in him on the first day. Sometimes he stepped closer, lifting her hand with a touch that was both instructive and unexpectedly gentle, guiding the movement of the shears as though teaching her a silent language only the vines understood. Their conversations drifted between practical matters and fragments of memory, the kind of soft, unhurried exchanges that fill the air between two people relearning how to exist in each other's presence. Luca spoke sparsely, but with an honesty that surprised her, offering small glimpses into his days, his routines, and the quiet corners of his solitude. Elena, in turn, found herself sharing details she had not meant to reveal: the exhaustion of city life, the feeling of drifting without direction, the strange comfort she felt returning to a land she once fled. These confessions were not dramatic, nor were they deliberate. They simply rose to the surface in the sun-warmed stillness of the vineyard, carried by the hum of cicadas and the scent of crushed grape leaves. At midday, they ate together at the long wooden table beneath the pergola, where vines climbed overhead and cast shifting patterns of shade across their plates. The meals were simple, but the quiet moments between bites held a fragile intimacy, a shared glance, an unspoken understanding, the accidental brush of their hands when reaching for the same bowl. Elena noticed how Luca's expression softened when he laughed, how the lines of grief etched into his features seemed to loosen, if only slightly, when he forgot himself in the ease of the moment. And yet, beneath that fleeting warmth lingered something unresolved, a heaviness she sensed even when he smiled, a grief that had shaped him long before her return. As the afternoons stretched into evenings, the vineyard transformed into a tapestry of orange light and elongated shadows. The land, vibrant and alive, seemed to breathe around them, carrying their unspoken emotions in the rustle of leaves and the creak of old wooden posts. Elena felt strangely anchored here, as if every step among the vines pulled her deeper into a life she had once imagined, but never claimed. And though she treasured the growing familiarity between them, a quiet unease nestled in her chest, warning her that this closeness stood on fragile ground. She sensed that the past, hers, his, and the vineyard's, had not yet revealed all its truths. One evening, after Luca said goodnight and disappeared down the path toward his own home on the property, Elena remained on the terrace, watching the last threads of sunlight dissolve into the sea. The warmth of the day clung to her skin, but inside she felt the faint tremor of something she could not name. Longing, perhaps, or fear of what might surface if they continued down this path of shared routines and half-formed confidences. She wrapped her arms around herself, listening to the soft murmur of distant waves, and wondered whether they were moving toward something bright or toward a truth sharp enough to cut through the delicate peace they were beginning to build. The night settled quietly over the vineyard, but Elena did not feel entirely at ease. She sensed that this fragile harmony, tender as it was, could not remain untouched for long, and yet she could not bring herself to step away from it. Something had begun to change between them, something she feared and desired in equal measure. The coming days, she knew, would test whether the connection growing between them had the strength to survive the truths waiting beneath the soil of this land. The third week in the vineyard began with the restless wind drifting in from the sea, stirring dust across the old stone floor of her grandfather's study as Elena pushed open the door. She had entered the room intending only to tidy the shelves, perhaps chase away the traces of silence that clung to every corner. But the moment she stepped inside, the weight of the past seemed to settle around her like a forgotten scent. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight, drifting over piles of yellowed papers and brittle notebooks filled with her grandfather's looping handwriting. She touched the back of his old leather chair, feeling a tenderness she hadn't expected, and then, almost as if the room wished to reveal something, she noticed a small wooden box wedged behind the books on the lowest shelf. Inside lay a single envelope, the paper softened by years, yet still sealed with the same deliberate care her grandfather had given to everything he once loved. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter, the ink faded but legible, each sentence unfolding a truth she had never imagined. It spoke of a decision he made decades ago, a choice born of desperation during a season of loss, a choice that had rippled outward and touched Luca's family with quiet devastation. As the words sank in, Elena felt the air thicken around her, as if the walls themselves tightened in recollection. The letter did not accuse, nor did it apologize. It simply told the truth, stark and unadorned. And in that truth, Elena felt the sudden, painful realization that her inheritance carried not only fond memories, but also the echoes of a wound that did not belong to her. She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes burning. Though she had played no part in the events described, the guilt coiled in her stomach like a cold serpent. How could she continue working beside Luca, laughing at his dry humor, accepting his quiet kindness, when she now knew the weight he carried was tangled with her own family's history? When she saw him later that afternoon, standing beneath the pergola with sunlight filtering through the vines, she felt a sharp stab of shame at how easily he greeted her. His smile, small but genuine, pierced her with its sincerity. She wanted to return it, but her throat tightened, and instead she only nodded, afraid that any warmth she offered would be a lie. Their work that day felt strained, though Luca could not entirely understand why. He asked her, gently, if something was wrong, stepping closer, concern softening the usual steadiness in his voice. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words tangled against the truth pressing inside her, and all she could offer was a vague, trembling assurance that she was tired. Her evasiveness widened the silence between them, and Luca, sensing the shift yet unable to interpret it, withdrew into himself with the quiet resignation of a man familiar with loss. The vineyard, once a place of growing harmony, now echoed faintly with their uncertainty, the rustling leaves sounding like whispered accusations Elena could not silence. That night, she climbed onto the flat rooftop above the old cellar, a place she used to escape to as a child, and sat with her knees drawn to her chest. The moon hung low over the hills, casting silver light across the vineyard, illuminating every row she had walked beside Luca, every corner of the land they had tended together. The letter rested in her pocket, feeling both heavy and unbearably fragile. She stared at the lunar shimmer on the leaves below and felt her heart twist with the realization that she was beginning to care for him more deeply than she had allowed herself to admit. And with that realization came a fear sharper than any she had known. The fear of losing him, not because of her own mistakes, but because of a truth buried long before she ever understood its power. The wind carried the faint scent of grapes almost ready for harvest, sweet and intoxicating, yet Elena felt none of its warmth. Instead, she felt suspended between what she wished to hold on to and what she feared would break the moment she revealed it. Under the moon's pale glow, she whispered to herself the question that had been growing inside her since the letter fell into her hands. How does one confess a truth that could shatter the fragile beginnings of love? There was no answer, only the quiet night stretching endlessly across the vineyard, and Elena's growing certainty that the path forward would demand a courage she had not yet learned to possess. By late afternoon, the sky above the vineyard had darkened into a restless, bruised blue, the kind that announces a storm long before the first drop of rain touches the ground. The wind pushed through the rows of vines in uneasy gusts, rustling the leaves in a way that made Elena's pulse quicken, as though the land itself sensed the turmoil rising within her. She had avoided Luca all morning, drifting from task to task without purpose, her mind circling the letter concealed in her pocket like a trapped bird beating against the walls of her chest. But with each passing moment, the truth grew heavier, impossible to contain. The storm was coming, and she knew she could no longer wait for clarity or courage to arrive on its own. When the first rumble of thunder echoed across the hills, she found him in the old storage building near the edge of the property. Luca stood at the open doorway, watching the sky with a frown of concern, one hand braced against the wooden frame, as if anchoring himself against a world that refused to stay still. He turned when he sensed her presence, and something in the way his eyes softened, tentative, questioning, nearly broke her resolve. She stepped inside, breath trembling, and closed the door behind her as the wind drove a spray of dust across the floorboards. For a moment they simply looked at each other, suspended in the charged air between thunderclaps. "Luca," she began, her voice fraying at the edges. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said days ago." He straightened, brows knitting, a flicker of apprehension passing through his expression. "Elena, what's wrong?" But she could not ease into the truth gently. The words surged forward, raw and unsteady, tearing through layers of fear she had carried her entire life. She told him about the letter, about her grandfather's decision made in a moment of desperation, about the consequences that had rippled outward until they collided with Luca's family in ways she could barely comprehend. She spoke in fragments at first, then in a flood, each confession landing between them like stones dropped into deep water. The storm outside cracked open the sky, lightning spilling white fire across the room, as if illuminating every hidden corner of their histories. Luca listened in stunned silence, his face tightening with each revelation. Not in anger toward her, but in a dawning, overwhelmed grief. The grief of a man who had spent years gathering the fragile pieces of a broken world, only to feel them slip from his hands once more. When she finished, her breath unsteady, he pressed a palm to his forehead and turned away, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he whispered, and the hurt in his voice cut through her like cold steel. "I was afraid," she said, tears rising. "Afraid of losing this, whatever this is between us. Afraid that my family's past would take that from us too." Her confession ignited something sharp in him. He spun back toward her, not in fury, but in anguish. "Elena, you think I haven't lost enough? You think I can survive another truth held back until it's too late?" His voice cracked, revealing the rawness he had guarded so fiercely. In that moment, the storm outside seemed to invade the room, thunder shaking the wooden beams, rain slamming against the roof in relentless sheets. They stood inches apart, two people caught between the weight of the past and the trembling possibility of a future neither could yet claim. She stepped forward, reaching for him, but he flinched as if her touch might undo the last thread of control he possessed. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Not because of what your grandfather did, but because you thought I couldn't bear the truth, because you didn't trust me with it." The words hollowed her from the inside. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came, only the echo of her own fear. Then Luca shook his head slowly, as though trying to clear the storm from his thoughts, and walked past her toward the door. When he opened it, the rain rushed in, soaking the threshold, drenching his clothes within seconds. He hesitated only long enough to murmur, "I need time," before stepping out into the torrent without looking back. Elena remained standing in the dim, trembling quiet of the storage room, her body shaking not from the chill, but from the realization that the truth she had carried so heavily had now torn the fragile bond between them. Outside, the storm raged, fierce and unyielding, but inside she felt something far more frightening, the fear that she had just lost the man she was beginning to love. The thunder rolled into the distance, yet the silence he left behind felt louder than any storm. The morning after the storm arrived with a strange, unsettling brightness, as though the sky had been scrubbed clean while the world beneath it remained bruised. Elena stepped outside before the sun had risen fully, the ground damp beneath her feet, the vineyard shimmering with droplets that clung to every leaf and wire. The vines seemed eerily still, recovering from the night's violent winds, and in their silence she felt the echo of her own turmoil. Luca was nowhere in sight. His absence wrapped around her with a familiar ache, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like a thread pulling gently at the seams of her heart. She busied herself with small tasks, though her hands trembled when she reached for tools or baskets. The weight of the confession and of Luca's hurt followed her through the rows like a shadow refusing to fall behind. Every place they had worked side by side, the trellis he'd fixed, the table under the pergola, the narrow path they walked each morning, now seemed to hold a faint residue of something fragile and unfinished. She caught herself glancing toward the lane leading to his cottage, hoping for a glimpse of him, and then chastising herself for wanting too much too soon. She had done what she believed was right, and still the truth had wounded them both. Luca, meanwhile, spent the morning wandering the far end of the vineyard, where the land sloped gently toward a grove of olive trees. He walked there not for the work, but because the quiet felt easier to bear than facing the questions storming inside him. The confession Elena had made had shaken him, not because he blamed her, but because it reopened a door he had worked tirelessly to close. Grief, when stirred, carried a sharpness he feared he could not withstand. Yet, beneath the pain, there lingered something unexpected, an ache not for the past, but for the woman who had stood before him last night, trembling with truth and fear and something not far from love. He tried to push the thought away, only to find it returning with quiet insistence. By midday, Elena forced herself to sit at the long wooden table for lunch, though she could barely swallow. The chair beside hers, the one Luca had occupied for weeks, remained empty, and the absence felt like a word left unspoken between two sentences. The vineyard hummed with afternoon heat, and she leaned back, letting her eyes drift across the landscape. It struck her then how much the land required of them: patience, resilience, honesty. Nothing grew here without effort, without tending to the roots beneath the soil. And perhaps, she thought, the same was true of what had begun between her and Luca. Later that afternoon, as the sun lowered and cast the world in warm amber light, Elena found herself drawn to the terrace. She stood there in the golden quiet, staring out at the stretching rows of vines, when she heard faint footsteps on the gravel behind her. Her breath caught, not in hope, but in fear of disappointment. When she turned, Luca was standing a few meters away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable beneath the soft glow of the evening. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall, but like a fragile space waiting to be crossed. "I shouldn't have left like that," Luca said finally, his voice low, as if testing its own steadiness. "I needed time, but disappearing wasn't fair to you." Elena exhaled slowly, feeling something inside her loosen. "I understand. I didn't expect forgiveness. I just didn't want to hide anymore." He nodded, looking past her toward the horizon, and the small motion held more vulnerability than any confession he had made before. The air around them felt different now, not soft, not fully healed, but open in a way that suggested possibility rather than ending. As the last edge of sunlight slipped below the sea, they stood together without touching, united not by resolution, but by the quiet acknowledgement that neither of them had truly walked away. The storm had broken something open inside both of them, not to destroy, but to reveal what still remained beneath the layers of grief and fear. When Luca finally spoke again, his voice was gentler. "We'll talk. Not today, but soon." Elena nodded, letting the promise settle like the first calm breeze after a long night of thunder. The evening deepened into blue, and though they parted without another word, the silence between them had changed shape. It no longer carried the weight of distance, but the subtle tremor of something waiting to grow again. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness Elena had not expected. The vineyard, shaken but resilient after the storm, began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. The ripening grapes swelling beneath the heat, the vines stretching toward the sun with quiet determination. Elena threw herself into the work, not to escape her thoughts, but to stay grounded within them. Each morning she awoke unsure whether she would see Luca, and each evening she went to bed holding on to the fragile hope that whatever had broken between them was not beyond repair. She no longer feared the silence. She understood now that healing often happened within it. Luca returned gradually, not with dramatic gestures or sudden declarations, but with small acts of presence. A repaired fence post she had been avoiding, a basket of tools left neatly by the cellar door, his distant silhouette moving among the vines at dawn. He did not approach her immediately, yet neither did he withdraw. Instead, he lingered at the edges of her days, as though rediscovering how to inhabit the same world beside her without reopening old wounds too abruptly. Elena sensed the shift, subtle but unmistakable. The quiet was no longer an absence, but a preparation. One evening, as the sun descended in molten hues of amber, casting long shadows across the vineyard, Elena carried a basket of freshly cut grapes to the terrace. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the bittersweet scent of nearing harvest. She placed the basket down and exhaled, letting her gaze drift across the land that had challenged her, humbled her, and taught her the weight of truth. Footsteps approached behind her, steady, unhurried, and she did not need to turn to know they belonged to Luca. He joined her at the rail, hands resting loosely on the warm stone. For a while, they said nothing, the silence between them no longer tense but companionable, like the quiet before a necessary conversation begins. The light caught the side of his face, softening the lines carved by grief, revealing a man who had carried too much but was beginning to put some of it down. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, honest, stripped of all defenses. "My family's pain, it doesn't belong to you," he said. "It never did. And your grandfather's choices, they were his, not yours." He paused, letting the truth settle. "But your courage last night, telling me everything. I don't think I realized how much I needed someone to stop hiding from me." Elena's breath trembled, and she turned to meet his gaze. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "Afraid of being the reason you hurt again. Afraid of losing something before it truly began." A small, wistful smile touched his lips. "We've both lost enough," he murmured. "Maybe it's time to choose something different." He reached out then, not with urgency, but with a tenderness so careful it felt like a vow. His fingers brushed hers, hesitated, then intertwined with them, as though testing whether the world would allow such closeness again. This time, nothing pulled them apart. The evening breeze wrapped around them, warm and forgiving, carrying the distant hum of cicadas and the soft rustle of ripening vines. They stood that way for a long time, their hands clasped, their hearts steadying into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar yet deeply right. Her confession had not broken them. It had cleared the ground on which something new could grow. Luca exhaled, the sound almost a release, and for the first time since the storm, his shoulders relaxed, not in resignation, but in acceptance. As night settled over the vineyard, lanterns flickered to life along the terrace, casting golden halos across their faces. Below them, the rows of grapes glimmered in the fading light, ready for the harvest, a testament to resilience, patience, and the quiet work of tending to what matters. Elena understood then that this land was no longer merely an inheritance. It was a beginning. Luca turned to her fully, his voice soft but certain. "We don't know what the future looks like," he said, "but I'm willing to find out, if you are." She nodded, unable to hold back the warmth rising in her chest. "I am," she whispered, and the simplicity of the words felt like the truest promise she had ever made. The final moments of daylight painted the sea in shimmers of rose and gold as they stood side by side on the terrace, their joined hands illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. The vineyard stretched beneath them like an open story still being written, one shaped by sorrow, honesty, and the quiet, fragile courage to begin again. And in that tender, luminous pause between day and night, Elena realized that the last summer in the Sicilian Vineyard had become the first chapter of something enduring, something healed, something hopeful, something finally, undeniably theirs.